Since 2020, major global economies have been carrying debt loads so heavy they face a punishing choice: either impose severe austerity to balance the books, or pay crushing interest rates that drag down growth. But there is a glaring exception. This chart compares the post-pandemic debt trajectories of major economies. While advanced nations like the US, France, and the UK see their debt levels climbing, India's trajectory moves in the exact opposite direction. Zooming in, India reduced its government debt to GDP ratio by 7.1 percentage points, while sustaining world-leading economic growth. Standard economic models suggest that rapidly paying down national debt usually stalls out a developing economy. India, however, accelerated through the deleveraging process by coordinating its revenue and spending in a way most nations find difficult to execute. To understand the mechanics, we first have to look at the domestic deficit. This graph plots India's central fiscal deficit, the gap between what the government earns and what it spends. During the pandemic, that gap peaked at 9.2% of GDP. But look at the trajectory since then: a smooth, unbroken decline, budgeted to hit just 4.4% for the upcoming fiscal year. Economists call this process fiscal consolidation. Normally, having a national deficit in just 5 years requires a government to slash public services and aggressively raise taxes. It's a process that usually guarantees deep economic pain for citizens and swift political backlash for the leaders who enforce it. Yet India executed this massive consolidation without imposing brutal austerity measures on its population. The specific policy choices regarding how the government collects its money, and more importantly, how it spends it, tell the real story of this recovery. Closing a budget gap requires generating more revenue. But rather than sharply hiking the base tax rates on citizens and corporations, the government decided to optimize the underlying plumbing of its collection system. They built a framework called Nudge. This diagram illustrates how it works. By leveraging behavioral economics and large-scale data analytics, the tax department identifies potential non-compliance from raw data. But instead of triggering a hostile audit, the system sends a prompt to the taxpayer with relevant information, encouraging a voluntary correction. It bypasses the costly, time-consuming route of traditional litigation. On the indirect tax side, they rolled out the GST 2.0 reforms. They rationalized the goods and services tax by compressing it into fewer rate slabs and deliberately lowering the tax burden on everyday essentials. Cheaper goods stimulated higher consumption volumes, which offset the lower individual tax rates. Combining these tech-driven compliance tools with a simplified tax structure successfully pulled a massive amount of informal business into the formal economy. The result was record-high tax collections, providing the cash flow needed to shrink the deficit. Bringing in more money is only half the equation. The other half requires a ruthless shift in how that money is deployed. In government budgeting, there is a constant tug-of-war between revenue expenditure, which covers day-to-day operations and subsidies, and capital expenditure, which builds physical assets like roads and power grids. For years, a massive portion of India's budget bled out through inefficiencies in the subsidy system. To stop the leak, the government aggressively scaled up direct benefit transfers, using digital identity rails to send funds straight into citizens' bank accounts. This precise targeting saved billions of dollars that used to vanish into the bureaucracy. This chart reveals exactly where those savings went. As the revenue expenditure curve compresses, you can see the capital expenditure curve expanding in tandem. The government took the money saved from plugging subsidy leaks and poured it directly into infrastructure, doubling their pre-pandemic average to reach an effective capital expenditure rate of 4%. The central government can be as disciplined as it wants, but that effort is easily erased if individual state governments decide to borrow and spend recklessly. Recently, several states began rapidly expanding unconditional cash transfers. These open-ended payouts provide an immediate burst of political popularity, but they firmly lock state budgets into rigid, long-term debt cycles that leave almost no room for any actual development. To prevent the states from dragging down the national balance sheet, the central government introduced a powerful financial countermeasure, the Scheme for Special Assistance to States for Capital Investment, or SASCI. SASCI operates on a specific leverage point. The central government offers the states 50-year interest-free loans that locks the money behind strict legal conditions requiring infrastructure development and economic reform. This program successfully neutralized the fiscal pressures at the state level. It engineered a scenario where state governments were heavily incentivized to build productive physical assets rather than sinking further into debt-fueled consumption. Underneath these broad policy shifts, there are hidden technological upgrades to the government's internal financial plumbing. The most important of these is the transition to a just-in-time funding model. Previously, the government used a credit push model, transferring massive, upfront blocks of cash to implementing agencies, where it often sat idle for months. By switching to a debit pull system, where funds are only released the exact moment an expense is incurred, they eliminated huge pools of parked cash, saving substantial interest costs on borrowed money. These back-end tech integrations replace the leaky, analog bureaucracy of the past, turning the state apparatus into a precise logistics engine that maximizes the economic impact of every single rupee deployed. Zooming back out to the macroeconomic picture, India has officially moved away from chasing rigid, arbitrary deficit targets. Instead, the government has adopted a flexible, medium-term goal of keeping the national debt to GDP ratio around 50%. This new framework gives policymakers the freedom to invest aggressively during global crises, while maintaining a clear, mathematically sound boundary that preserves the trust of global credit rating agencies. This trajectory stems from two distinct efforts. The government combined behavioral economics and tax collection with a relentless engineered pivot toward heavy physical assets. Which brings us back to the global debt trap. The data out of India offers a clear counter-narrative to the rest of the world. Debt is not inherently dangerous. It only becomes a trap when you use borrowed money to pay for your past, instead of having the discipline to use it to buy your future.